The heavy timber door of the trading post swung open, letting in a swirl of bitter, snow-laden air that made the men huddled around the stove flinch. Abel stood in the doorway, a figure so large he seemed to block out what little light the winter day offered. His hair and beard were long and tangled, dusted with ice from his journey down the mountain, and the sheer breadth of his shoulders stretched the seams of his heavy buckskin coat. The low chatter in the room died instantly. Men who moments before had been laughing loudly now studied the floorboards, their bravado shrinking in the presence of the mountain's quiet king. Abel's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over the room, missing nothing. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for salt, flour, and coffee, the simple necessities that drew him from his solitude only a few times a year. But his gaze stopped. In the far corner, pushed away from the warmth of the stove and the company of men, was a woman. She was small, wrapped in a dark green dress that had seen better days, and seated in a crude wooden chair with wheels. Her face was pale with cold, her dark hair neatly braided, but her eyes held a stillness that was not of this place. She was Chinese, a stranger in a land that was not kind to strangers, and she was utterly alone. Mr. Finch, the post owner, wiped his hands on a greasy apron. "Abel. Didn't expect to see you till the thaw." His voice was thin, an attempt at friendliness that fell flat. Abel grunted, his eyes still fixed on the woman. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep in the earth. Finch shrugged, a gesture of careless dismissal. "Came with some railroad surveyors. They passed through yesterday. Said she was an inconvenience. Her legs don't work. They just left her." The words hung in the air, thick with cruelty. "Abandoned. A piece of unwanted baggage." The woman, Leanne, did not look up. She stared at her own hands, clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a careful mask of nothing. Abel looked from her still form to the smirking faces of the other men, and a cold fire kindled in his chest. He saw their judgment, their casual cruelty. He saw her dignity, a tiny, flickering flame in a room full of icy wind. He strode across the room, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor. He stopped not in front of Finch, but in front of her. He knelt, a giant of a man, lowering himself until his eyes were level with hers. For the first time, she looked at him. Her gaze was clear, intelligent, and filled with a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. He said nothing to the others. He spoke only to her, his voice softer than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "Come with me." The journey back up the mountain was a silent battle against the elements. The snow was deep, clinging to the pines and swallowing the narrow trail that only Abel could follow. He had purchased his supplies, his movements efficient and grim, ignoring the stunned silence that had followed his declaration. He had bundled Leanne in a thick wool blanket he'd traded a prime pelt for, tucking it around her until only her face was visible. He pushed the awkward wooden wheelchair, its wheels sinking into the snow, his immense strength the only thing keeping them moving. For every 10 feet of progress, it felt like a mile of effort. The chair was not made for this. It was a thing of flat lands and smooth floors, not the rugged, unforgiving terrain of his world. After the first hour, he stopped. Without a word, he gently lifted Leanne from the chair. She was impossibly light in his arms, a bird with broken wings. He secured her to his back using a length of rope and the blanket, her body warm against his. Then, he collapsed the chair, tied it to his pack, and continued his ascent, his own 2 feet now their only conveyance. Leanne remained perfectly still, her cheek pressed against the rough texture of his coat. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart, the shift and pull of his muscles with every step. She watched the world go by in a blur of white and green, the air so cold it burned her lungs. She had expected fear. When the men who had brought her this far had left her at the post, she had prepared for the worst. She had not prepared for this. This strange, silent giant who had looked at her not with pity or contempt, but with something else. Something she couldn't name. He did not speak. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots in the snow, his steady breathing, and the sigh of the wind through the trees. He moved with an unnerving certainty, a man who was not just in the wilderness, but of it. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, he finally slowed. Ahead, nestled in a grove of ancient pines, was a cabin. It was small, sturdy, made of thick, dark logs, with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It looked as solid and solitary as the man who had built it. He had brought her home. He carried her inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around them like a welcome embrace. The interior was simple, clean, and fiercely masculine. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire already burning low in its hearth. There was a rough-hewn table with a single chair, a bed built into the far wall piled high with furs, and shelves holding a few books and neatly stacked supplies. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived a life of deliberate solitude, a space not meant for two. Abel gently unwrapped her from his back and set her carefully in the single wooden chair by the table. He unfolded her wheelchair and placed it near the fire, the wood steaming as the ice melted away. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the flames. Leanne looked around the small space, her heart a confusion of gratitude and uncertainty. This man had saved her, but she did not know him. She did not know what he wanted. Abel moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, hanging his coat, and unpacking the supplies. He seemed to fill the entire room, his presence immense and overwhelming. He never looked at her directly, yet she felt his awareness of her in every movement. Finally, he ladled some stew from a pot hanging over the fire into 2 bowls. He set one on the table in front of her, along with a piece of dark bread. He took his own bowl and sat on a low stool by the hearth, his back partially to her. They ate in silence. The stew was rich with game and root vegetables, the most satisfying meal she had had in months. It was the food of survival, honest and nourishing. When she was finished, he took her bowl without a word, rinsing it in a bucket of water. He then gestured toward the bed. "You sleep there, it wasn't a question." He pointed to a pile of spare furs near the hearth. "I'll be here," Leanne hesitated, her gaze falling on the large, comfortable-looking bed. It was his bed. "I can," she began, her voice raspy from disuse, "I can sleep in the chair." He turned then, and his eyes met hers fully. The look was not unkind, but it was unyielding. "You'll sleep in the bed," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She nodded, unable to speak. Later, after he had banked the fire and the cabin was lit only by the soft orange glow of the embers, he lifted her as easily as he had before and carried her to the bed, placing her gently on the soft furs. He pulled a heavy quilt over her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they tucked it around her shoulders. He retreated to his spot by the fire, wrapping himself in his own furs. Leanne lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of his steady breathing on the other side of the room. She was warm, she was safe, and she was more terrified than she had ever been. The days fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Abel would rise before dawn, his movements hushed so as not to wake her. He would rebuild the fire, put coffee on to boil, and then disappear into the grey morning light. He would return hours later, sometimes with firewood stacked high on his shoulders, other times with fresh game. He was a man of immense labor, his life a constant, steady effort against the wilderness. Leanne, in turn, found her own ways to contribute. Her legs were useless, but her hands were deft. Abel left a pile of mending on the table one morning, a shirt with a torn sleeve, a pair of buckskin trousers with a seam coming loose. When he returned that evening, he found them neatly repaired, the stitches small and perfect. He said nothing, but he held the shirt in his hands for a long time, tracing the line of her work with his thumb. From her chair, she kept the fire fed during the day, ensuring the cabin remained a pocket of warmth against the relentless cold outside. She organized the shelves, sorted dried beans, and learned the simple mechanics of his home. She began to prepare their evening meal, chopping the vegetables he left for her, her wheelchair pulled up close to the table. He would come in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, and the smell of hot food would greet him. It was a change he never commented on, but she saw it in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the slight softening of his stern expression. Their conversations were brief, purely practical. "More wood?" she would ask, her voice still quiet. "I'll get it," he would reply. The coffee is hot, thank you. Yet, in the spaces between these spare words, something else was growing. It was a fragile trust, built not on promises but on actions. He never treated her like an invalid. He simply saw what she could not do and compensated for it, while respecting the things she could. He would lift her into bed each night and out of it each morning, his touch always impersonal, always respectful. She was a responsibility he had taken on, and he was a man who did not shirk his duties. One afternoon, he came back from his traplines earlier than usual. He found her by the small window, her mending forgotten in her lap, staring out at the snow-dusted pines. There was a profound loneliness in her posture, a stillness that seemed to ache. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. He had lived with solitude his entire life, had chosen it, but seeing it on her felt different. It felt like a wound. He walked over to the hearth and added a log to the fire, the sudden burst of sparks making her turn. He didn't look at her, but he spoke to the flames. "It's a hard country," it was the first thing he had ever said that wasn't a question or a direct instruction. It was an observation. An offering. Leanne watched his broad back, the way the firelight played over his tangled hair. "I have seen harder," she replied softly. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers in the dim light. He saw the truth of her words in the depths of her dark eyes. He saw a history of pain she did not speak of, a resilience forged in fires he couldn't imagine. He had brought her here to save her from the cold, from the cruelty of other men, but he was beginning to understand that her survival had never truly depended on him. She had a strength that was quieter than his, but no less powerful. It was the strength of endurance. What does a person do when the world they knew is gone, and the future is a path they cannot walk? Do they stop, or do they learn to see the world from where they sit? Leanne had learned to see. She saw the way the snow fell differently on the firs than on the pines. She saw the tracks of a fox that passed the cabin every morning. And she saw the deep, guarded loneliness in the man who had offered her his home. The world had taken her legs, but it had not taken her sight. It's a strange thing, isn't it, how two people can live in the same small room and still be miles apart, each trapped on the island of their own past. But sometimes, all it takes is one small bridge, one quiet word, to begin to cross the distance. Abel returned to his seat by the fire, but the silence that fell between them now was different. It was no longer empty. It was shared. He picked up a piece of leather and a knife and began to work, his hands moving with practiced skill. She picked up her needle and thread. And in the small, warm cabin, surrounded by a world of white, two solitary souls continued their silent work, together. A week later, the sky turned a bruised grey, and a blizzard descended upon the mountain. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and snow fell so thick and fast that the world beyond the cabin window disappeared completely. For 3 days, they were sealed inside, prisoners of the storm. The forced proximity changed the very air in the room. The space that had once seemed manageable now felt intensely small, charged with their silent awareness of each other. The simple routines of the day became shared acts. They ate all their meals together at the small table, the fire their only light. On the second day of the storm, Abel was cleaning his rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a rhythmic sound in the quiet room. Leanne was reading one of the few books from his shelf, a worn copy of Shakespeare. Her English was good, learned long ago from a kind missionary. "What is your name?" he asked suddenly, his voice startlingly loud in the muffled silence. She looked up from her book, her finger marking her place. He had never asked before. She had assumed he didn't care to know. "Leanne," she said. He tested the name on his tongue, the sound soft. "Leanne," he nodded once, as if filing the information away. He did not offer his own name in return. A little while later, she was the one to break the silence. "Why?" He looked up from his work, his brow furrowed. "Why what? Why did you bring me here?" The question hung between them, the one she had been too afraid to ask, the one he had never offered to answer. He stopped what he was doing and stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be searching for words, a task that was clearly more difficult for him than wrestling a bear or felling a tree. I don't hold with leaving people behind, he said at last, his voice a low growl. It was a simple answer, but it held the entire weight of his character. It was his code, the moral compass of a man who lived by his own laws. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and heavy. And they were looking at you like you were already gone in that moment, she understood. He had not seen a burden. He had seen a person the world was trying to erase, and he had refused to let it happen. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first crack in the wall of her own solitude, a flicker of belonging in a life that had been stripped of it. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, something had settled. The space between them had shrunk, no longer an empty void, but a quiet field where understanding was beginning to grow. On the fourth day, the blizzard broke. The sun came out, weak but brilliant, turning the fresh snow into a blanket of blinding diamonds. The silence was profound. Late that afternoon, a sound broke the stillness, the crunch of snowshoes, the low murmur of voices. Abel was outside splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar comfort. He stopped, his head lifting like a wolf sensing danger. He saw them coming through the trees. It was Mr. Finch from the trading post, and with him was another man, a trapper whose cruel eyes Leanne remembered. Abel set his axe down slowly and walked to the front of the cabin, planting himself in front of the door. He was not holding a weapon, but he didn't need one. His very presence was a barricade. Finch stopped a few feet away, a nervous, greasy smile on his face. Abel. Just checking in. Wanted to make sure everything was all right up here. After the storm, his eyes darted past Abel, trying to peer into the cabin. Everything is fine. Abel's voice was flat, cold as the ice on the eaves. Well, it ain't proper, the trapper sneered, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Abel's feet. A man like you, alone up here with a foreign woman. People are talking. Abel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. Let them talk from inside. Leanne had wheeled herself to the window. She could hear their words, see the ugly meaning in their expressions. A familiar, cold dread washed over her. We just think maybe she'd be better off somewhere else, Finch continued, trying to sound reasonable. Somewhere more suitable. The trapper took a step forward. Or maybe you're just tired of her. We could take her off your hands. Find some use for her. The suggestion was vile, slithering into the clean mountain air like a snake. Abel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He took one slow step forward, and the sheer, intimidating power of him made both men stumble back. The air around him crackled. She is not your concern, he said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. She is home. This is her home. Now get off my mountain. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply stated a fact, as immutable as the stone beneath their feet. Finch and the other man looked at the raw, untamed force standing before them, and the last of their courage evaporated. They turned and scrambled away, their retreat clumsy and fearful. Abel stood there until they were long gone, a silent guardian watching over his domain. He came back inside, the cold air clinging to him. He shut the door, the heavy thud echoing the finality of his words. He did not look at Leanne immediately, but went to the fire, poking at the logs with a furious energy. She saw that his hands, the hands that could split a log with a single blow, were trembling. She wheeled her chair closer to him, her heart pounding. She had seen cruelty before. She had seen indifference. But she had never, in her entire life, had someone stand for her like that. He had not defended her as property or as a burden he was obliged to carry. He had defended her as a person who belonged. He had called this place her home. He finally turned from the fire, his face a mask of granite, but his eyes were filled with a storm of emotion. He looked at her pale face and wide eyes, and a deep, raw ache moved through him. A promise. In that single, shared touch, everything changed. The arrangement of practicality and duty dissolved, replaced by something fragile and real. He was no longer just her rescuer, and she was no longer just his ward. They were two people in a small cabin, holding on to each other against a cold and unforgiving world. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, and for the first time, the silence between them was filled not with questions, but with the quiet, certain beginning of love. As the days grew longer, the iron grip of winter began to loosen its hold on the mountain. Patches of earth appeared from beneath the melting snow, and the chirping of birds returned to the forest. The thaw that was happening outside was mirrored within the walls of the cabin. The quiet tension that had once defined their existence had melted away, replaced by a warm, easy companionship. Abel began to talk more, sharing small details about the mountain, the name of a bird, the best place to find early spring greens. Leanne, in turn, began to smile, a rare and beautiful sight that transformed her face. Her quiet laughter, when it came, was a sound Abel found he wanted to hear again and again. He started making small changes to the cabin. One day, he spent hours outside with an axe and saw, and by evening, he had built a sturdy, smooth ramp leading up to the cabin door. He installed it without a word, but when he helped her guide her chair down it for the first time, letting her sit in the weak afternoon sun, the look she gave him was more eloquent than any words of thanks. She was no longer confined to the four walls of the cabin, he had given her a small piece of the outside world. He began bringing her things from the forest, a curiously shaped stone, a fallen bird's nest, a sprig of pine that filled the room with its sharp, clean scent. One afternoon, he returned with a single, resilient wildflower he had found pushing its way through a patch of melting snow. He placed the small purple blossom in a cup of water on the table beside her. It was a simple, humble gift, but it was a declaration. It spoke of beauty found in a harsh place, of life persisting against the odds. It was a reflection of her. Their evenings changed, too. They would sit by the fire, the silence now comfortable, companionable. Sometimes he would read to her from his book, his low voice a steady, soothing rumble. Sometimes she would tell him stories of her home, a place of silk lanterns and bustling markets, a world so different from his that it seemed like a dream. He listened, rapt, watching the firelight dance in her dark eyes. Their physical closeness became more natural. His hand would brush hers as he passed her a bowl of stew. He would let his hand rest on her shoulder for a moment longer than necessary after lifting her into bed. Each touch was gentle, restrained, but filled with a deep and growing affection that both of them now understood. One night, the air was soft with the promise of spring. A gentle rain tapped against the roof, a soothing rhythm in the quiet of the mountains. The fire was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Abel was sitting on his stool, sharpening a knife, the scrape of steel on stone a familiar sound. Leanne was watching him, her mending lying forgotten in her lap. She looked at this large, quiet man who had become the center of her world. She saw the strength in his hands, the kindness in his guarded eyes, the fierce loyalty that was as solid as the mountain itself. She had arrived here as a piece of abandoned cargo, a burden. But he had never made her feel that way. He had given her safety, respect, and something she had thought she would never feel again, a sense of belonging. Abel finished his work and set the knife aside. He looked across the small space at her, her face soft and thoughtful in the firelight. The cabin was no longer just his shelter. Before Leanne, it had been a place to sleep, to eat, to escape the cold. It was functional. But now, it was a home. Her presence had filled the empty spaces, had brought a warmth to it that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He had spent his life valuing his solitude, believing it was all he needed. He realized now how wrong he had been. He had not been living, he had been waiting. He rose from his stool and walked over to her, his movement slow and deliberate. He knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. Her fingers were cool and he warmed them between his own. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them a vulnerability she had never seen before. He did not have the words for poetry or grand declarations. His language was one of action, of truth, of simple, profound sincerity. "Leanne," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Before you came, this was just a place I lived." He paused, searching for the right words. "Now, I don't want to imagine it without you." He looked down at her wheelchair, then back up at her face. "This mountain is a hard place. My life is a hard life, he took a breath, his heart pounding in his chest. But it's a good life. If you'll share it, it wasn't a proposal of grandeur, but of partnership. Of a shared future, built on the foundation of what they had already survived together. Tears welled in Leanne's eyes, but this time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of joy. She squeezed his hands, her answer in the strength of her grip, in the radiant smile that lit up her face. I am already home, she whispered. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, hesitant at first, then deepening with all the unspoken emotion that had passed between them for months. It was a kiss of gratitude, of promise, of a love that had grown, like a wildflower, in the most unlikely of places. The rain fell softly on the roof, washing the world clean, and inside the small cabin, two souls, once lost, had finally found their way.